Yeah, so like Sarah said, it is a bit of a long title, but I hope it makes itself clear by the end of the talk. So we are exploring different types of participants in the Chilean student movement. And this is my first PhD study, which I think it's almost done. We're in the final stages of writing, hopefully, to send it to a journal. So just to start with some, I guess, broader context, we've seen protests against inequality around the world rising, and we've seen it in different types of countries, especially before COVID. And we know that negative consequences of inequality are well documented in research. We know that people that live in more unequal countries have lower levels of happiness, lower levels of well-being, among other things. So it makes sense that people are protesting against it. But something that has caught my attention is that when you see these social movements, you see individuals from lower, middle, and upper class protesting against inequality. And this involvement, especially of the upper class, seems to be a bit paradoxical to me, because by engaging in these protests to reduce inequality, they stand to lose some of the privileges that being on top of that particular hierarchy gives them. So when it comes to the question of who engages in collective action and trying to explain this involvement of the upper class, we know that one implicit assumption seems to drive most of the research, and it is that it's generally assumed that disadvantaged group members and not advantaged group members are those who engage in collective action. And this is perhaps the story that makes more sense, because with an eye on improving your in-group's own status or situation, especially when it is considered illegitimate or unfair, it is assumed that those who take part in collective action are from disadvantaged groups. But we know right now that this is not the whole story. And in the past few years, there's been a lot of research exploring motivations for advantaged group members to get involved in collective action. And research points to maybe shared or superordinate identities with the disadvantaged groups, anger or moral outrage toward the situation of other groups or other groups' deprivations, moral convictions against inequality, or some maybe self-focused motives like need for moral affirmation or acceptance, or you just want to look good by engaging in these social movements. So in this research, we want to take this issue of motivation, but explore it through kind of a different lens. So we want to focus on both advantaged and disadvantaged group members, but here we want to focus on the type of action that both groups engage in and the way they choose to participate in the social movements. And another thing we want to kind of change up a bit is the method that we're going to use. So usually most research in collective action has used variable-centered approaches, which in simple terms means that we usually look at the relationship between two variables, and we assume that that relationship will be consistent or will be the same for every person in our population. So this kind of approach ignores some unique response patterns that exist within subgroups of the population. We might find subgroups in our samples where that relationship between two variables is different from other groups in our sample. And this is of particular interest for collective action research, where we naturally try to classify people in groups. We're always looking at people that participate versus people that don't participate, people that engage in conventional actions versus people that engage in radical actions. So here, by focusing on the individuals and not the variables itself, we think we might be in a better position or a complementary position to previous research to understand different groups of individuals or different classes of individuals, both advantage and disadvantage, and the type of actions they choose when they engage in collective action. So to find these kind of subgroups, we will use 4 variables that have been widely used in collective action research. And we will go over each one of them right now. So the first one is social class, and it's probably one of the most novel things about this study. So research in collective action and social identity theory both have focused on understanding when and why individuals engage in collective action that are aimed to change the hierarchical structure of society. However, both of these lines of research have been more interested in studying power or status hierarchy more than wealth hierarchies that in this case would be reflected by social class. And social class becomes particularly relevant when economic inequality is high and growing, like we saw in that first slide, because it is more likely that income and wealth differences become more visible and fitting basis for categorizing the self and others. So when we look at social movements against inequality, we might find some interesting, maybe unexplored dynamics, because we see upper, middle, and lower class people getting involved in the same social movement, but they may not feel as allies when they are participating. This is because inequality might make opposing interests more salient. So lower class individuals might be more interested in social change to improve their situation, while the upper class might be more interested in maintaining the status quo and maintaining that privileged position in society. And as we know by now, we need both upper and lower class people to join the fight against inequality if we want to achieve social change. But inequality itself might be dividing us even more. So this might become one more negative consequence of inequality, that the more inequality becomes a problem, the less united the fight against inequality is going to be. So the second and third variable we're going to use are probably the most common variables that we find in collective action research, which is conventional and willingness to engage in conventional and radical collective action. So they are both behavioral responses to social movements against inequality, but conventional collective action follows commonly accepted social rules and does not disrupt the status quo. So things like participating in discussion meetings or attending pacific protests, while radical collective actions directly threaten the existing order of this existing social order. So things like confronting the police or participating in barricades or occupying buildings. And research has shown that they have different antecedents. So research has focused on exploring whether people get involved in either conventional or radical collective actions. And if you've read this type of paper, you can probably imagine the models they have on there. So you usually have like two paths, and one leads to conventional actions, other one leads to radical actions. And this research usually tries to predict if people get involved in either one or the other. But we know by now that people may engage in a mix of actions. We know that collective action and social movements are very dynamic. So we want to go a step further here and try to find out what these patterns are. And furthermore, upper, middle, and lower class might have different patterns of participation when it comes to engaging in conventional or radical collective action. And this is something that has not really been explored before. So the fourth variable that we're going to use is social identification with the social movement. And we know that social identification is by far one of the most important predictors of involvement in collective action. And it also seems to be an important predictor of whether people choose to get involved in either conventional or radical collective action. And here we find different explanations in previous research. So on one hand, we have evidence that high identifiers will be more willing to get involved in radical action, because it seems like an extreme and effective way to advance the group's interest. However, we also find evidence that it is those that are less identified that are those more likely to engage in radical action. And in line with social identity theory, the explanation for this might be that extreme actions might damage the in-group's image. So higher identifiers might have more to lose by engaging in radical actions. And this same line of reasoning could apply when we try to explore the type of action that upper class individuals choose to get involved when it comes to collective action, as they might be more worried about their in-group status and reputation, and this could lead also to an inhibition of radical action. So once we've used these 4 variables to try to make the subgroups in our sample emerge, we're going to try to predict membership to these groups. So we will use 2 variables here. So previous research shows that group efficacy and nothing to lose are predictors of willingness to participate in either conventional or radical action. And we think that it might also influence the types of action that upper, middle, and lower class individuals get involved in. So when it comes to first group efficacy, conventional actions are more likely to occur when participants have high levels of group efficacy. And on the other hand, the likelihood of radical action is higher when individuals feel that their group is powerless to influence social change. And something similar happens with nothing to lose. Those that have nothing to lose are more likely to engage in radical actions. So here we have kind of 2 lines of research maybe to explore. On the one hand, we can look at it through a lens of social movement research, which is what most of research in collective action has done before, that those that feel power to change, so high group efficacy, will probably choose conventional actions. However, if we look at it through more of like a social class perspective, we might also see that upper class individuals should feel higher group efficacy because they usually have or feel that they have more power and influence. And at the same time, they might also have something to lose by engaging in radical action. So it will be interesting to see what happens here and how this kind of interplay between social class, group efficacy, and nothing to lose, and the willingness to engage in collective action. So what happens there? So just to wrap everything up a bit, so what we're trying to do here, the 2 questions we're trying to answer is, can people be meaningfully classified into subgroups according to their form of participation? So if they are willing to participate in conventional or radical collective action, their social identification with the social movement, and their social class. And since most of research in collective action is usually cross-sectional, and rarely tracks intentions over time of participating, we also want to explore how stable these subgroups are over a 1-year period. So once people are assigned at one time point to a group, whether they stay in that group or if they change maybe to another group in 1 year. So the method we're using here, and it's something I've already talked about a bit, but it is called like a person-centered approach. So it's basically a latent class analysis and latent transition analysis. And just to put it in very simple terms, or the way latent class analysis work is that we take our 4 variables, so social class, intention of participating in radical collective actions, and social identification. We put everything into a mixer, which is our data analysis program, and the program will give us an X number of groups. And the way it forms this group is that all the people that respond similarly to the variables we're using will be put in one group. So every person will be similar to other people in the same group, but the groups will be different from each other. And we basically do latent class analysis in 2 time points, and then we can run latent transition analysis, which allows us to estimate transitions between groups over 1 year. So whether participants stay in one group or change to other groups. So it is basically 3 steps. So first, we're going to build our subgroups using our 4 variables at time 1 and time 3. Then we will try to predict this group membership using group efficacy and nothing to lose. And as a 3rd step, we will do latent transition analysis to explore transitions over 1 year. So to give you a bit of information about the study and the context where it takes place. So this research was conducted in Chile, a country with high levels of inequality and a lot of social movements since the 90s after dictatorship ended. And the Chilean student movement was one probably of the most important ones. It started around 2011 and it ended 2019, and it demanded public, free, and quality education. And it was pretty successful. They managed to get the government to change a lot of important policies around education. And what was interesting about this, it was that it was mainly led by university students. So students from different socioeconomic backgrounds got involved in the social movements. And you saw that a lot of the leaders were mainly upper class students. So I collected this data when I was working as lab manager back in Chile, and I got to use it for this first PhD study. And it is a 5-wave longitudinal study. So we went to 5 universities in Santiago, which is the capital of Chile. And we asked first-year students to take part on the survey. They would have to answer 1 time each semester. So it's 5 waves that started in May 2017, and it ended on, I think, May 2019. And here we're just using the first and the third wave, mainly because of 2 reasons. So first, we thought that 1 year was a good amount of time to explore transitions between one group and the other. And also it was a time when the student movement was still very active. So towards the end of 2019, other social issues came to play, and they kind of, all the protesting started to be around other issues, not the student movement anymore. So this is kind of the last hurrah of the student movement until like May 2018. And yeah, we have 1,220 participants in wave 1 and 926 at wave 3. So we didn't have a lot of attrition, probably because we gave very good monetary incentives. So we have a lot of participants that remained at the study for the 5 waves. So if we look here at the results, just to guide you a bit on if you don't know this type of graphs, these are violin plots. So every point you see here is 1 participant. This line here is the mean. The box here is the confidence interval. And if you see that this, for example, here is a bit thinner than here, it's because you have a higher distribution of participants in this area versus this area. So it's basically allowing us to see the distribution of each group. So if we start by seeing the first group, something just to mention, we still have some debates about the name of the group. So if you have any suggestions, they will be very welcome at the end. So the first group we have here, we labeled non-participants. We see here in the willingness to engage in conventional collective action that the mean is quite low. If you see the distribution, the highest point is above 6. So we do have some intentions to get involved, but most of the students are not really willing to get involved in conventional collective actions. And if we see here, the radical collective actions is even less, it's almost non-existent. So it's participants that don't really think about participating in collective action. If we see the social identification, we see that it's pretty low as well, although not as low maybe as you could imagine. And I think this is because since it was a student movement, just by being a student, you did feel like some kind of identity with the movement. It was a very like widespread movement where if you were a university student. So we do have like a very long distribution here, but the mean is lower than the other groups. And if we see here at perceived social class, we use here the measure where participants have to place themselves either in 10 steps. So 10, it's upper class and one would be lower class, we see that the mean is showing that it's mostly upper class participants. And we see the distribution. They are grouped on the upper end of the scale. We don't really have lower class, or we have like a little amount of lower class participants here. If we then look at the conventional group that we label, because their intentions to participate in conventional actions are pretty high. So the minimum here was around 3. So we see that these are all willing to engage in conventional actions. And when we look at the radical actions, that again, we see that it's pretty low, right? These participants are also not really willing to get engaged in radical actions. If we look at social identification with the movement, they are very identified. So we have like most of participants are here above the 3. The mean is also very high. So they're definitely identified with the student movement. And if we see social class, this is probably the most diverse group. So we see that we have participants almost from like 1 to 10, but the mean again, most of the participants seem to be middle class participants. Then the third group we labeled moderate participants, because they have, again, high intentions of getting involved in conventional actions, and they are kind of in between, maybe not really sure about engaging in radical actions. It seems to be an option, but maybe not as high. If we look at social identification, it's pretty similar to what we saw in the previous group. So again, they are highly identified, most of them. And if we see the social class, it is similar to the previous one, although we seem to have more middle class here. So we don't really have like that high or really low class. But very similar to the conventional group we just saw. And the last group is the radical participants, which is the smallest group, but it's still 100 people. And we see here that they will go to anything that the movement throws at them. They have high intentions of participating in conventional actions, high intentions of participating in radical actions. Again, they are highly identified, which kind of proves that line of research where we saw that high identifiers were the ones willing to get involved in radical actions. And again, we see here that the distribution in social class is very similar to the previous groups, although we do have a bit of upper class here, like a few individuals here that were not in the moderate group. But again, the kind of like the core population is middle class here. So now that we have these 4 groups, we try to predict class membership. So what does group efficacy and nothing to lose predict membership to either one of these groups? And we found significant results around nothing to lose. So we used the radical participants group as the reference group, and nothing to lose increased the probabilities of being assigned to the radical groups versus all other groups. So if your nothing to lose score was high, you were probably going to be assigned to the radical participant, which again makes sense with previous research. Like as more as you feel nothing to lose, you will engage, or you will be willing to engage in any type of action. So you're assigned to the radical participants. Group efficacy, however, did not predict much. It only increased the probability of being assigned to the radical participants only when compared to the non-participants. So this again makes a bit of sense, since the non-participants were the ones that were not really willing to engage in collective action. So it is the most different group. If you remember the distribution, the conventional, moderate, and radical participants were pretty similar to each other. The one that was the most different was the non-participant group. And as the last step of the study, we did the latent transition analysis. So we did the same latent class analysis at time 1, which would be this column here, and at time 3, which would be this column here. And the results were very similar. So we extracted the same 4 groups at both time points. And if we see here, we can see which participants stayed within the group or which changed. So think of it as each line here is one participant. So if we look first at the non-participants, so these were the participants that were not willing to engage in collective action and were mostly upper class, they mostly stayed in the same group. We see a small group here that moved to the conventional ones, so the ones that were high on intentions of getting involved in conventional actions, and another group that changed to the moderate ones, but it's pretty stable. If we look at the conventional participants, it's very similar, and it's also very stable, although we see a bit more change. And the most notable one is here to the moderate participants. So they probably increased a bit their intentions to get involved in radical actions. If we look at the moderate participant, it's probably the one that's less stable. So we see here transition to the conventional participants and another one to the radical participants. And the last one, the radical participants, also has a bit more change, but the majority of participants stayed within this group. But if they change to the moderate participants, so they probably decreased a bit their intention to get involved in radical collective actions. But we don't have major shifts. Like you see people that moved maybe to the non-participants to the radical ones, there's none. As well as maybe the other way around, from radical to non-participants, it's a very, very small group. So the transitions almost don't happen. So groups are very stable. And if they do happen, it's not major. They usually move from to groups that are very close or that are very similar. So as a summary of the results we found, so it was interesting to work with this methodology because it allowed us to find different subgroups of people that engage in a mix of collective action. So particularly, we see that those who are willing to engage in radical collective action are also highly willing to engage in conventional action. So it's not like they give up conventional action to engage in radical action, they just start doing more maybe. And even though, this is evidence that even though conventional and radical collective action might have different antecedents, individuals that intend to participate in radical actions will be motivated to participate in conventional actions as well. When we look at social class, it was maybe a bit disappointing because we don't really find a lot of differences. The only group that was maybe separated from the others was the non-participants, where we find mostly upper class people. So this is in line with what previous research has shown as well, that upper class participants are not always willing to get involved in this type of social movements. We also have that high identifiers are willing to get involved in radical actions. So it proves that line of research that we saw at the beginning, that it's those that are highly identified with the social movement, those that are willing to get involved in radical actions. We found that nothing to lose was a predictor of willingness to get involved in radical action, but not really group efficacy. And I guess the most interesting thing or the main takeaway here is this new focus on the middle class, which makes sense if you look at the Chilean context. When it comes to education, the middle class doesn't receive the public or government benefits that the lower class receives. And they don't have the money to pay for university like the upper class. So they do have to take a lot of debt to pay for education. So we might talk of them as relatively deprived. So they feel this sense of injustice and that they are taking in the end the worst of the situation. And that might be why they moved forward with, or they pushed the engagement in collective action and involvement in the social movement. So yeah, thank you for listening.